Hey, Tere, and welcome to Shadows of Thales. I'm glad you found your way here tonight. This little corner where darkness softens, and stories breathe quietly in the background. Before we drift into tonight's tale, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if what you hear truly feels right for you. Your comfort matters more than anything else. If you'd like, share in the comments where you're watching from and what time the night found you. I love seeing how our growing community gathers from so many different places. It's a reminder that even in silence, we're connected. I hope you'll allow this video to accompany you for a while. Every story here is shaped to ease your thoughts, soothe your mind, and guide you gently into the late hours with a touch of mystery and calm. So go ahead, lower the lights, make yourself comfortable, take a slow breath, let the noise of the day melt away. And now, let's step into tonight's story together. The sea was calm when we left port. To calm. The kind of stillness sailors don't trust, where the water looks like dark glass, and the horizon feels closer than it should be. The engine hummed steadily beneath my feet, and the lights of the shore faded behind us without ceremony. This voyage was supposed to be simple. A straight route, clear coordinates, no reason to deviate. Yet from the first night, something felt unfinished, like a sentence that refused to end. I stood on deck long after the others had gone below. The moon hung low, its reflection stretched thin across the water. No waves broke it. No wind disturbed it. The ship cut through the sea without sound, as if the ocean itself had agreed to let us pass unnoticed. I checked the navigation lights, all working. The compass, steady. The instruments, normal. Still, the feeling remained. Around midnight, the shoreline vanished completely. Not gradually. One moment there were distant lights. The next there was only darkness, thick and complete. No fog, no storm, just absence. I told myself it was distance. Nothing more. Nothing more. When I went below deck, the corridors felt longer than before. The hum of the engine sounded muted, as if wrapped in cloth. Crew members passed me without speaking, their footsteps slow, deliberate. Everyone seemed tired in the same way, as though sleep hadn't quite worked for any of us. I tried to rest in my cabin. Sleep came in fragments, short, shallow dreams of standing at the rail, watching land approach but never quite arrive. Each time, I woke with the same sensation, motion without progress. At some point before dawn, I heard it. A bell. Not loud, not urgent, just a single distant toll, deep and slow, as if coming from far out at sea. I sat up, listening. No one else stirred, no second sound followed. I dressed and went back on deck. The sea looked unchanged. Flat, endless, moonless now. Though the sky was clear, the ship moved forward, the wake stretching behind us like a pale scar in the water. I checked our position. The coordinates made no sense. They weren't wrong, they were repeating. We were moving, burning fuel, following course. Yet our location remained the same. I refreshed the system. Checked again. Summer result. That was when I noticed something else. The horizon ahead was subtly darker than the rest of the night. Not fog, not cloud. Just a thin line where the sea seemed to refuse light. We were heading toward it, and for the first time since departure, I wondered if this ship was not meant to reach shore at all, only to keep sailing, quietly, endlessly, between departure and arrival. As the first hints of dawn touched the sky, I went to find the captain. His cabin was at the end of the officer's corridor, a place usually filled with the scent of coffee and the low murmur of the radio. But today, the corridor was silent. The air was cold, stagnant. I knocked on his door. No answer. I knocked again, louder this time, calling his name. Silence. An unspoken rule at sea is to never enter the captain's cabin uninvited. But the repeating coordinates and the dead silence were not normal. I turned the handle. It was unlocked. The cabin was empty. His logbook was open on the desk, the pen lying next to it as if he'd just stepped away. But his bunk was made perfectly neat. and his uniform hung in the closet, untouched. I walked over to the desk. The last entry was from just after we'd left port. It read, "Weather clear. Course set, all is well." Nothing else. No mention of the strange stillness, the sudden disappearance of the shoreline, or the feeling of being stuck in place. It was a standard, routine entry. Bad next to it, on a small, torn piece of paper, was a single word, scribbled hastily. Listen. Listen. To what? The engine? The sea? I stood there, trying to hear past the low thrum of the ship. Nothing. Just the same muted hum. I went to the cabin's porthole and looked out. The dark line on the horizon was closer now, more defined. It wasn't a shadow. It was an edge. A place where the reflection of the sky simply stopped. It was like looking at the border of the world. Then I heard the bell again. This time, it was clearer, closer. A single, resonant chime that seemed to vibrate through the hull of the ship itself. I rushed back out on deck. A few other crew members were there now, their faces pale in the early light, all looking in the same direction. They had heard it too. One of them, a young decade named Miller, pointed toward the dark line. "What is that?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. No one had an answer. We were all just staring at it. This impossible boundary we were steadily approaching. I pulled out my personal compass. The needle was spinning wildly, completely useless. The ship's main compass on the bridge was frozen, stuck pointing due north, regardless of which way the ship was turned. Every piece of navigational equipment was failing in a different, nonsensical way. The GPS was still repeating the same coordinates, locking us in a single point in the middle of the ocean, even as we moved. The radio was dead. Not static, just pure, empty silence. We were completely cut off. The day wore on, but the sun never seemed to rise any higher. It stayed low in the sky, casting long, strange shadows that stretched and warped across the deck. The light felt thin, weak. The air grew colder. We were sailing in a perpetual state of dawn. The crew moved like ghosts, their conversations short and hushed. Fear had settled over the ship, a quiet, creeping dread that was far worse than any panic. We continued our duties out of habit, checking ropes, polishing brass, swabbing decks. We did it because we didn't know what else to do. I spent most of the day on the bridge, trying to make sense of the instruments. I went through the ship's charts, old paper maps that we kept for emergencies. According to our last known position, we should have been in open, charted waters. There were no warnings, no anomalies, no legends of a dark line or a silent sea. It was as if we had sailed off the map and into a place that didn't exist. As the perpetual twilight continued, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. It wasn't a person, not a physical presence. It was the sea itself. The water, still glassy and unnaturally calm, seemed to be observing us. I'd catch strange, fleeting shapes in its dark surface, things that looked like they were moving just below, always just at the edge of my vision. When I'd look directly, there was nothing. Just my own reflection staring back. That evening, another crew member vanished. An engineer named Harris. He was last seen heading to the engine room for his shift. When he didn't report back, a search party was formed. We searched every corner of the ship, from the cargo hold to the crow's nest. He was gone. No trace. His tools were left on a workbench, neatly arranged. His cabin was untouched. It was as if he had simply ceased to exist. The quiet fear on board began to curdle into something sharper. Now we weren't just lost, we were being taken. One by one. The bell tolled again that night, and 'tis time everyone heard it. It came from all directions at once, a deep, mournful sound that seemed to pass right through us. We were no longer sailing toward the dark line on the horizon. We were in Italiano. The sky above was now pitch black. No stars, no moon, no lingering dawn. The only light came from the ship itself, and it seemed to be swallowed by the oppressive darkness just a few feet from the rails. The water below was no longer reflective. It was a void, a black, empty space where the sea should have been. I stood at the bow, staring into the nothingness ahead. The ship moved forward, but there was no sense of speed, No sound of the hull cutting through water. We were adrift in an ocean of darkness. I thought about the captain's note. Listen. I closed my eyes and tried. I blocked out the hum of the engine, the creak of the ship, the distant, nervous coughs of the crew. And then I heard it. Underneath it all, a sound so low, it was almost a feeling, a whisper. It wasn't in English, or any language I knew. It was a collection of sounds, a chorus of soft, sibilant voices rising from the black water. They weren't threatening, they were inviting. They spoke of rest, of an end to the journey, of letting go. They promised a peace that we hadn't felt since leaving port. The temptation to just lean over the rail, to slip into that quiet darkness, was overwhelming. I opened my eyes, my heart pounding. A few other crew members were standing near the rail, their bodies slack, their faces empty, as if hypnotized by the sound. Miller, the young deckanhead, was already starting to climb over. I grabbed him, pulling him back onto the deck. He struggled for a moment, his eyes wide and unfocused, before he seemed to wake up, shaking and confused. The whispers were a lullaby, and we were all getting very, very sleepy. We had to do something. We couldn't just let the ship carry us deeper into this silent, whispering abyss. I gathered the remaining crew on the deck. There were only 12 of us left. I told them what I had discovered, the repeating coordinates, the captain's disappearance, the whispers from the dark. I told them that whatever this place was, it was trying to claim us. We couldn't trust our senses. We couldn't trust the sea. We had to trust each other. The decision was made. We would turn the ship around. It was a desperate, illogical move. We didn't know which way was back. Our compasses were useless, but staying on this course was a death sentence. We are two tre. We went to the bridge and fought with the helm. It was heavy, resistant, as if some unseen force was trying to keep us on our path. It took 4 of us, straining with all our might, to turn the wheel. Slowly, groaning in protest, the ship began to change course. As we turned, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They twisted from inviting to angry, hissing at us from the darkness. The ship shuddered, and the single bell began to toll. Not slow and mournful now, but fast and frantic. A deafening alarm. The light from our ship flickered, threatening to die and leave us in complete blackness. But we held our course, turning the ship back toward where we thought we came from, sailing by pure instinct and blind hope. For hours, we sailed through the screaming dark, the ship shaking, the bell clanging, the whispers trying to tear our minds apart. We held on, teeth gritted, hands clenched, refusing to give in. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The bell went silent. The whispers faded. The ship stopped shaking, and ahead of us, a single pinprick of light appeared in the darkness. A star, then another, and another. The blackness receded, and the familiar, stardusted night sky returned. I looked over the side. The water was water again, dark and deep, with the light of the stars reflecting on its surface. The ship's engines hummed with their familiar rhythm. I rushed to the bridge. The compass needle was steady. The GPS was showing a new set of coordinates. We were moving again. We were free. We never spoke of what happened in the dark. There were no entries in the log, no official reports. The missing crew members, including the captain, were listed as lost at sea during an unexpected storm, a storm that never happened. We created a lie to cover a truth no one would believe. When we finally saw the lights of the shore, it felt like a miracle. We had left port with a full crew and a simple destination. We returned with half a crew and a secret that would haunt us forever. Sometimes, late at night, when the sea is too calm and the sky is too dark, I can still hear it. That single, distant toll of a bell. And I know that the ship is still out there, sailing on a silent sea, forever caught between departure and arrival, still calling for the rest of its crew. If you enjoy stories that explore the chilling mysteries of the unknown, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. We'll be diving into more unsettling tales every week. What do you think happened to the ship and its crew? Let me know your theories in the comments below. By morning, the sea was still calm. Too calm, really. To explain the madness I'd seen on the instruments, the crew moved about their duties in an eerie quiet, avoiding conversation, as if we'd all made an unspoken pact. Something was deeply wrong. But I mean it, saying it out loud would make it real. I went back to the bridge and checked the navigation systems again. And again. Again. The result was the same. The same coordinates, the same heading, the same impossible, maddening conclusion. Our engines were running, the propellers were turning, we were sailing. But we weren't going anywhere. I decided I had to bring it up with the captain. I approached him carefully, framing it as a technical anomaly, a glitch in the system. He listened without a single interruption, his eyes fixed not on me, but on that dark line I had seen during the night, stretching across the horizon. "It will resolve itself," he said finally, his voice unnervingly calm. To calm. His certainty didn't reassure me. It terrified me. That night, the bell rang again. This time, it rang twice. A deep, metallic, distant sound. I was already awake, lying in my bunk, staring at the ceiling. I knew instantly it wasn't our bell. It wasn't any buoy marked on our charts. It was coming from out there, from the sea itself. I threw on my clothes and hurried out on deck. I wasn't the first. Others were already there, lining the rail in a silent vigil. No one spoke, no one asked questions. We all faced the same direction, staring into the same stretch of water ahead. The dark line on the horizon had grown wider, closer. It wasn't fog. It didn't drift or swirl like weather. It was stark and solid, as if the sea itself had folded inward, creating a boundary. A wall. It was a line it didn't want us to cross, but for some reason, it was allowing us to approach. That's when I noticed something else. Something that made the blood freeze in my veins. I looked over the stern. The wake. It was gone. There was no churned water, no white trail marking our passage. Nothing. We were moving forward, the ship vibrating with the effort of the engines, but we were leaving no trace behind. It was like we were a ghost gliding over the water, not a vessel cutting through it. Things only got stranger below deck. Down in the mess hall, the clocks had all gone haywire. They disagreed with each other. Some were running impossibly fast, the second hands blurring. Others ticked by with agonizing slowness. One clock, hanging by the galley door, had stopped entirely, its hands frozen at the exact moment we had left port. Then I found the logbook. The recent entries were written in familiar handwriting. The first mate isinate iscrete, but the dates, they were days ahead of us. Tomorrow. The day after tomorrow. And one line was repeated, scribbled over and over again in the margins. No shore in sight. No shore in sight. My heart hammering. I dug out the crew manifest from the captain's office. I had to be sure. I read through the names, one by one. Every sailor was there, including mine, but at the very bottom of the page, written in a different, spidery ink, was an additional note. A single line that hadn't been there when we set sail. It said, "Passengers, unknown." We had no passengers. That was the moment the engines began to slow down. It wasn't the sound of failure, not a cough or a sputter. It was a smooth, deliberate settling, as if the ship itself had found a speed it preferred, a rhythm it was content with. On deck, the world was changing. The dark boundary ahead had spread across the entire horizon, from port to starboard. It was swallowing the stars, swallowing the very concept of distance. The line between sea and sky was gone. Then the bell rang, one final time. It was so close now, it felt like it was right beside the ship. The captain turned to us, his face a calm mask in the dimming light. He spoke quietly, his voice barely a whisper against the sudden silence. "We've arrived." No one asked where. We didn't have to. As our ship crossed that impossible boundary, the sea went completely, utterly still. The hum of the engines faded into nothing. The lights on the ship dimmed, not from a loss of power, but as if they had simply become irrelevant. Outside, where the ocean should have been, There was no more water, only a flat, endless, featureless black. A void that reflected nothing. Not the stars. Not our ship. Not ourselves. We did not dock. We did not drop anchor. We did not stop. We simply continued sailing forward, into a place that exists between departure and destination. A place where lost ships sail forever. And the shore is just a memory. Something you remember but can never, ever reach. They say that sometimes, late at night, if you're near the coast and the water is calm, you can see us. A ship moving in total silence on the dark water, our navigation lights shining steady. Never turning. Never changing course. Never arriving. Still sailing. Thanks for watching. We saw the lights before we saw the ship. They were just small, steady points glowing against the dark horizon, but they were too deliberate to be stars. They didn't flicker, they didn't drift. They just waited. The radar showed nothing unusual. We sent out a hail, but received no distress call. There was no registered vessel in this area. Yet the lights remained, a silent invitation on the black water. As our boat drew closer, the outline of the ship emerged from the darkness. It was huge. Old, its hull was scarred by years of time and salt, a veteran of countless voyages. But something was wrong. No flag flew from its mast. We couldn't see any movement on its decks, but every single light was on. Cabin windows glowed warmly, painting soft squares of yellow on the night. Deck lights cast long, shimmering reflections across the water. Even the bridge was lit up, bright enough to suggest a full crew at their stations. But the ship was completely still, drifting without direction, a ghost on the tide. It must be abandoned. Someone on our crew whispered, but the word didn't feel right. The ship didn't feel abandoned. It felt watchful. We circled it slowly, our engines a low hum against the oppressive silence. We tried the radio again and again. Nothing, not even static. No sound carried across the water from the vessel, not even the thrum of generators that should have been powering those lights. The sea around it was unnaturally calm, the water like black glass, as if refusing to disturb whatever strange slumber the ship was in. I had to know what was going on. I volunteered to board. The air grew colder as our small dinghy approached its massive, rusted hull. The boarding ladder creaked softly under my weight as I climbed. The metal was cold and damp, but felt solid. The moment my boots touched the deck, the silence deepened, becoming heavy, absolute. The lights didn't flicker. If anything, they seemed to brighten just a fraction, as if acknowledging my arrival. The air smelled faintly of oil and old metal, the clean scent of a working ship. There was no decay, no rot, none of the smells you'd expect from a derelict. It just smelled empty. The impression was that the crew had left very, very recently. For the profound emptiness I was seeing all around me. I started walking the main deck, my footsteps echoing unnervingly. I passed open cabin doors, peering inside. Each one was the same. Bunks were neatly made, blankets folded with military precision. Personal items rested where they had been placed. Books opened on nightstands, half-empty cups on desks, clothes folded and stacked in lockers. Nothing was disturbed. Nothing was packed. It was as if every single person on board had stood up at the exact same moment and simply vanished. I made my way up to the bridge. The warmth hit me first. It was heated, comfortable. All the instruments were on. Screens glowed with scrolling lines of unreadable data. Navigation charts were spread out on the table. The captain's chair was empty, pushed back slightly as if its occupant had just stood up. The massive wheel was centered, holding a course to nowhere. And on the wall, a brass clock ticked steadily, each second landing with a weight that felt heavier than it should have been. I saw the ship's logbook lying open on the main console. I ran my fingers over the leather cover before flipping to the last entry. The handwriting was neat, calm. The words were simple, chilling. Lights remain on. That was it. No date, no signature, just that one final, cryptic sentence. And that's when I heard it, a soft click from somewhere deep within the ship's interior. A new light had just turned on, I hadn't even noticed it was off before. I stood frozen on the bridge, listening. But I wasn't listening for footsteps. I was listening for the absence of them. In that moment, the ship no longer felt empty. It felt awake, aware. It knew it wasn't alone anymore, and I had the terrifying realization that whatever had made the crew disappear had not gone far. What would you do? Would you run? Or would you venture deeper into the ship to uncover the mystery? This is just the beginning of the story of the ship where the lights stay on. We'll be exploring what happened to the crew, what powers the vessel, and what is waiting in its shadowy depths. The hum grew louder, not suddenly as slowly, like something remembering how to breathe. The lights along the corridor ahead brightened one by one, a glowing pathway leading deeper into the ship. I hadn't touched anything. No switches, no panels. The ship was responding on its own. I checked my radio. Only static. Only static. But it wasn't the harsh kind you expect out here. It was soft, rhythmic, almost like distant surf. I tried calling back to my crew, to the real world. Nothing answered. The silence felt intentional, as if the ship had decided which sounds were allowed to exist, and my voice wasn't one of them. I followed the lit corridor. Each step felt measured, as though the floor itself was counting them. The walls were lined with doors, all of them now slightly ajar. They hadn't been like that before. I peered into the first cabin. 10-2 next. Inside each one, the lights were on, illuminating a scene frozen in time. A chair pulled back from a desk, a cup half full on a table, a bed that was still warm to the touch. People had been here. Recently. Very recently. On one desk, I found a photograph. The frame cool against my fingers. It showed a crew standing together, their smiles stiff and formal, the vast sea stretching out behind them. I recognized the ship immediately, its nameplate clear in the photo. But then, I noticed something else. I counted the faces, and the number didn't match the manifest I'd seen back on my own vessel. There were too many people in the picture. Or maybe not enough names on the list. Someone was missing, or someone had been added. As I stepped back into the hallway, a clock on the wall chimed softly. A delicate, single note. I looked back at it, puzzled. The hands had stopped moving. The faint ticking I'd heard when I first came aboard was gone, replaced by a low, electrical whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It was a constant, almost living sound. I continued down the corridor until I reached the engine room door. It was warm, warmer than it should have been on a cold, drifting vessel. The hum was strongest here. I pushed the door open. Inside, the lights pulsed gently, like a slow, steady heartbeat. And the engines, they were running not at full power, not enough to move a ship this size. Just enough to keep it awake. That was when the lights on the bridge flickered. It was the first time since I boarded that something changed without becoming clearer. The glow dimmed, then steadied again. On the main screen, letters began to form faint, incomplete. Stay lit. The message hung there for a moment, then faded away, replaced by a reflection. But it wasn't my reflection. It was the bridge, but filled with people. Figures standing motionless at every console, their shapes dark against the glowing instruments. They were still, watching, waiting. I spun around. The bridge was empty. Just me and the humming machines. The radio crackled once, a sharp burst of sound. A voice tried to form, failing halfway through a word. The sound wasn't old. It wasn't distorted by static. It was just unfinished. Then the lights behind me began to switch off. One by one. Not randomly. Not quickly. They were following me, extinguishing the path I had just walked. Primera, dra, ene. The corridor seemed to stretch, the lights dying just behind my heels, leaving a darkness that felt thicker than any shadow. The exit hatch glowed ahead, a single point of light in the growing void, the only remaining star. When I finally scrambled onto the deck, gasping for air, the sea had changed. It was a perfect, dark mirror, reflecting the ship but not its lights. The water showed a dark silhouette, unlit and empty, as if the ship in the sea was how it was supposed to be, and the one I was standing on was some kind of illusion. I climbed down the ladder without looking back. The moment my feet touched the deck of my own boat, every single light on the abandoned ship went out at once. Total, sudden darkness. It was gone. When we checked our logs later, there was nothing. No record of the encounter. No coordinates on the chart. No log entry. It was as if it never happened. But sometimes, when you're far offshore, in the dead of night, other sailors still report seeing it. A drifting vessel, lights on, engines humming softly, just waiting. Waiting for someone else to come aboard, so it doesn't have to stay awake all alone. The island was not marked on any chart. We first saw it at dawn, a dark shape rising from the mist, like something that had been waiting patiently to be seen. Our charts were useless. No coordinates matched its position. Even the radar seemed to hesitate, as if it was unsure whether to acknowledge its existence at all. The captain, a man who rarely showed emotion, ordered us to slow the engines. No one asked why we all felt Italiano. The island had a presence, a quiet, heavy pressure that pressed against the ship's hull long before we were anywhere near its shores. As we drifted closer, we saw its trees. They grew too close together, their canopies so dense they formed a dark, unbroken mass against the gray sky. There were no birds circling above it. No waves broke against its silent coast. The sea around it was unnaturally still, like glass. Then, a sudden, violent rattle echoed across the deck. The anchor had dropped. On its own, the heavy chain screamed out, then stopped abruptly far sooner than it should have. I looked at the depth gauge. The reading was frozen, stuck on a number that made no sense. It didn't change, no matter how many times we tried to recalibrate. The ship was held fast, a prisoner to this uncharted place. The island was much closer now, and narrow, untouched beach stretched before us. The sand was impossibly smooth, as if it had never been disturbed by a single footprint or piece of debris. And beyond that perfect beach, the forest waited. It was silendence, and the trunks of the trees were aligned in a way that felt unnatural, intentional. It felt less like a forest, and more like a formation, standing at attention. That night, no one slept. The ship creaked and groaned softly around us, adjusting to a tide that didn't seem to exist. The island loomed beside us, a silhouette darker than the night sky behind it. I was on watch, my eyes fixed on the tree line, trying to pierce the oppressive darkness. At some point hours into my watch, I realized the trees were not still. They were leaning hoosts slightly toward the water. They weren't swaying in a breeze. There was no wind. They weren't bending Tewari hoost. Listening, inclining themselves towards our ship as if trying to hear our very thoughts. A soft sound behind me made me jump. Footsteps on the deck. Slow, bare. A crewman I barely knew. A quiet man named Thomas was standing near the rail, staring at the island. His expression wasn't fear, and it wasn't curiosity. It was something closer to relief. "I think it wants us," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I think it's been waiting for us." Before I could find the words to respond, to ask him what he meant, the ship's lights dimmed. They didn't go out completely. They just lowered, as if we were being asked to be less visible, to be more respectful. The dark water around us seemed to swallow the remaining light, absorbing all reflections until we were floating in an inky void. And then, from the heart of the forest, a sound drifted across the water. It wasn't a call. It wasn't a voice. It was a pattern. Something repeating, steady and patient. It felt like a signal, a rhythm meant to be answered, a heartbeat drawing us in. The captain emerged from the bridge, his face pale and drawn in the low light. "No one goes ashore," he commanded, his voice tight with an authority that was beginning to fray at the edges, under any circumstances. But his words were too late. We both turned to look. The gangway, heavy and mechanical, had already lowered itself to the water, its end pointing directly toward the silent, waiting beach. No one admitted to lowering the gangway. We checked the controls, went over the logs, and found nothing, not a single trace of anyone tampering with the system. Yet there it was, resting against the island's dark sand as if it had always belonged there. A silent invitation. The tide was unnervingly still, frozen in a state that felt less like calm and more like a held breath. The whole ocean seemed to be waiting. The pattern from the forest continued, a rhythmic pulse that had first drawn our attention. But now, I realized it wasn't just sound. It was timing, a complex sequence of pauses and pulses that repeated every few moments, as steady as a heartbeat. It never sped up, never slowed down. Once I tuned into it, I started noticing something even more disturbing. The ship itself was responding. The metal frame creaked in the same rhythm. The deck lights dimmed and brightened, almost imperceptibly, perfectly in sync. It was undeniable. The island was communicating with our vessel, and our ship was answering back. Then, a crew member stepped forward. I remember his name was Evan, a young deckhand on his first long voyage. His eyes were wide, but not with fear. It was more like recognition. Then another followed him, an older engineer named Marcus. Their movements were slow, deliberate, as if each step had been carefully approved before it was taken. No one on the bridge tried to stop them, not because we didn't want to, but because the very idea of interrupting felt fundamentally wrong, a violation of some unspoken rule. We just stood there, watching, as they crossed the gangway without a single glance back at the ship or at us. The moment their boots touched the sand, the forest shifted. It wasn't a dramatic, rustling movement that you could easily point to. It was more subtle, like a trick of the light. The spacing between the colossal trees seemed to change, opening narrow, winding paths that hadn't existed just seconds before. The island was making room for them, guiding them into its depths. We waited. Minutes passed, stretching into what felt like hours. Time itself seemed thinner near that shore, distorted and unreliable. We kept our eyes glued to the tree line, expecting to see Evan and Marcus return at any moment. But they didn't. Te Werigone, the strange, rhythmic pattern from the forest, however, never broke its steady, Patian tempo. It just continued its silent count. Then something else happened, something that sent a new wave of dread through everyone on deck. The anchor chain, our only physical link to the world outside this place, tightened with a deafening groan. It wasn't the feeling of the ship drifting. The sea was still unnervingly flat. This was different. It felt like we were being held, gripped by something immense and powerful beneath the waves. The captain screamed orders into the comms. Start the engines. Full reverse. But they refused to turn over. The diagnostic panels flashed green, showing no errors, yet the machinery was completely dead. The ship's compass, which had been behaving erratically, spun once, slowly and deliberately, before settling. It pointed directly at the heart of the island. I leaned over the railing, my heart pounding against my ribs, and looked down into the dark water. What I saw made the blood run cold in my veins. There were reflections in the still surface, but they weren't ours. They weren't the reflection of the ship or the sky. I saw shapes moving just beneath the surface, dark, thick lines that were aligned with the shoreline, mirroring the forest above. They were roots, massive, ancient roots, not buried in the sand of the island, but growing out into the sea itself. The island extended far beyond what we could see, anchoring itself to the deep ocean floor with the same unhurried patience it showed above the water. The realization settled over us like a shroud. This island wasn't just a piece of land floating in the sea. It was the other way around. The sea had grown around it. This place was ancient, foundational, a pillar of the world itself. And then a voice came from the forest. It wasn't spoken in words or any language we could understand. It was formed from the pattern itself, the rhythm becoming a carrier for pure intent. It felt like we were being counted, measured, as if the island was taking inventory of our ship, our crew, our very souls. The captain, his face pale and slick with sweat, finally gave the order. We were all thinking, cut the anchor. Cut the damn chain now. But again, no one moved. It was the same paralysis as before, the same feeling that any action would be a transgression. As if on cue, the anchor chain groaned one last time, a deep, resonant sound that vibrated through the hull. Then it went slack. It wasn't released by us. It felt accepted. The island had taken its due. The gangway began to lift on its own, rising from the sand with a slow, careful grace, folding back into the ship as if the island were done with us, its transaction complete. The moment it clicked into place, the engines roared to life without anyone touching the controls. The forest seemed to lean back. The strange, narrow paths closed up, disappearing back into the dense wall of trees. The rhythmic pattern faded, leaving behind a silence that was somehow more deafening than the sound had been. We left without turning back, pushing the ship as fast as it would go, not daring to look behind us. Days later, when we finally felt safe enough to take stock, the first mate checked the crew manifest. 2 names were missing, Evan and Marcus, but their names weren't crossed out. They weren't erased or marked as lost at sea. It was as if they had never been written there at all. Their records, their entire existence aboard our ship, had simply vanished. The charts were updated, of course, but the island was never found again. It never appeared on any satellite image or sonar scan. But sometimes, when the sea is perfectly still and the fog rolls in low and thick, sailors report seeing something strange in the distance, a shape on the horizon, a silhouette of trees where there should be nothing but open water, waiting patiently for the next ship to slow down, for the next crew to get just a little too curious, waiting to be noticed. Thanks for watching. The island welcomed us before we ever stepped ashore. That was the unsettling part. The shoreline was clear, the water shallow, the trees parted just enough to suggest a path. Smoke rose in a thin, steady line from somewhere. Inland, not a signal, not an accident. It was a habit. "This place is inhabited," the first mate said, his voice low. From the ship, we couldn't see any structures. No docks, no man-made lights, just that plume of smoke and a silence that felt practiced, like a room that had learned how to hold its breath. We decided to anchor anyway. The boat ride to shore was short. Almost too short. Each stroke of the oars felt heavier than the last, as if the water were thickening into syrup around us. When the keel finally touched sand, it didn't scrape. It settled, softly. The beach was marked with footprints. They were fresh, the edges crisp and clear. There were dozens of them, leading both to and from the tree line. But what was strange was their arrangement. None of them overlapped. Non crossed. They were laid out with a kind of eerie precision, as if every person who walked there knew exactly where to place their feet, following an invisible grid. We followed the path inland, the sand giving way to soft earth. The forest opened up suddenly into a clearing, and in it stood a small village of huts, arranged in a loose circle. They were simple structures, wood, rope, and large levzand. Looked well maintained, but they were all empty. Cooking fires smoldered in their pits, sending up that same thin smoke we'd seen from the ship. But there were no flames. Tools rested right where hands must have left them. Just moments ago, it felt like we had just missed everyone. "Hello!" Someone from our crew called out. The word fell flat, completely absorbed by the thick, humid air. And then we started to notice the details. Every single hut had a name carved above the entrance. Not symbols or titles. Names. Human names. Some were common, like John or Sarah. Some were Ulf, and then a few of the names matched people on our ship. My own name was there, carved into the wood above one of the doors. I took a step back, my heart pounding against my ribs, and bumped into one of the others. He wasn't looking at the huts. He was staring, completely transfixed, at a long table set at the very center of the clearing. Plates were arranged neatly, all the way down its length. Cups were filled with clear water, but here was the chilling part. There was one more place setting than there were huts. Someone was missing. Or maybe someone was expected. The smoke from the fires thickened for a moment, then thinned again, almost like a breath had been taken and released somewhere nearby. From the deep dark forest beyond the clearing, we heard movement. It was slow. The sound wasn't of something approaching or of something hiding. It was the sound of something waiting. Patiently, just then, the radio crackled at my hip. A whisper slid through the static. A sound that wasn't quite a voice, but something else, something ancient. It said, "You're early." A cold dread washed over us. We turned to look back the way we came, and we watched in horror as the path we had taken into the forest began to close. Branches leaned inward. Vines snaked across the ground, and the footprints on the beach began to fade from the sand, as if the island itself were erasing all evidence of our arrival. And that was the moment we finally understood. We weren't the first to land here. We were simply the next. No one came to meet us. The clearing stayed exactly as it was, fires smoldering, cups full, names carved cleanly above each hut. The smoke rose in a straight line, completely untouched by wind. It was eerie, like time had paused, not frozen. As if the island itself were allowing us a brief moment to notice exactly where we stood before things began to unravel. And then, they did. The table changed. One of the cups, my cup, was no longer full. A shallow ring of moisture marked where it had been lifted just moments before. But I hadn't moved. No one near me had moved. A cold dread washed over me. Someone, or something, had already joined us at the table. The whisper returned. This time, it wasn't a crackle over the radio. It was closer. A chilling, sibilant sound threading through the leaves just behind my ear. "We keep the ones who fit." And in that instant, I felt it, a strange, unsettling familiarity. These huts weren't just shelters. They were memories, physical manifestations of longing, rebuilt again and again by people who had learned the shape of the island before they understood they could never leave it. The names carved above the doors weren't claims of ownership. They were assignments. Panic finally broke the spell. One of our crew members, a young guy named Torres, bolted for the path back to the shore. He made it 3 steps before the forest closed in on him completely. The wall of green just sealit itself. There was no sound, no struggle, no cry for help. Only a slight rearrangement of shadows where a person had been just a second ago. The island didn't chase. It didn't need to. It simply absorbed. The smoke from the fires thickened, drifting across the clearing like a ghostly shroud. And for a moment, I saw them. Figures, standing just where the trees thinned out at the edge of the camp. They looked like people, at least from this distance. You could recognize posture, the way they held themselves, but they were just far enough away to blur their faces into indistinct smudges. And they were busy, repairing nets, tending the smoldering fires, setting more places at the long, wooden table. They were living the island the way it expected to be lived. They weren't ghosts. They were the island's inhabitants, going about their eternal routine. The captain's voice finally crackled faintly over the radio, strained and distant, almost a ghost itself. He was calling us back. He was telling us the tide had shifted unexpectedly, that the anchor wouldn't hold much longer. We had to leave now. But the whisper answered him before we could even form a reply. A voice that seemed to come from the very air around us said, "It will." A promise and a threat all in one. The anchor would hold because the island willed it. Then, something even more terrifying happened. One by one, the carved names above the huts began to fade, dissolving back into the wood grain. All except for the ones that matched the names of my crewmates still standing here with me. The island was simplifying, narrowing its choices, deciding who fit. I finally understood what that extra, empty place setting at the table meant. It wasn't for someone who was missing. It was for whoever decided to stay an invitation, an open slot. Pure instinct took over. I didn't run for the beach. The path Torres had tried. I ran sideways through a narrow gap between 2 huts that hadn't been fully closed off by the encroaching forest. The smoke burned my eyes, thick and acrid. The very air seemed to thicken, resisting each frantic breath, pushing back against me. Behind me, I could hear the sounds of the clearing rearranging itself. the wood and leaves groaning as they corrected for my absence, sealing the trap. I burst out of the tree line and onto the shore just as the boat was pushing off. The remaining crew were shouting, their hands reaching out for me across the churning water. The moment my feet crossed the waterline and I splashed into the sea, everything changed. The forest stilled, the smoke thinned and vanished. The air cleared. It was as if the island itself took a step back, receding into a profound and ancient silence. Just trees and stone, a desolate rock in the middle of the ocean. It was as if the entire settlement had never existed. Later, when our heart rates returned to something resembling normal, we counted. Not everyone had returned. Not everyone had been taken, either. One name was missing from the ship's manifest, a person we couldn't account for. And back on that island, one hut remained unnamed, waiting. Some islands don't need to be discovered. They're already full. And they're always looking for new residents. Thanks for watching. The map was correct until it wasn't. We checked it 3 times before leaving port. It was old parchment, carefully preserved, passed down between captains who trusted it more than any modern instrument. Every line was sharp, every mark intentional, a legacy of truth, drawn in ink. The first day at sea, it guided us perfectly, a silent, knowing companion. The second day, a reef appeared where none should exist. The chart insisted on open water. Our depth readings disagreed, dropping suddenly as if the seafloor had risen overnight to greet us. We altered course, a minor inconvenience, and made a note in the ship's log. By nightfall, something was wrong. The map had changed. A thin ink line now traced the detour we had taken. It was new, darker than the rest, a fresh wound on ancient paper. No hand had touched it. No pen lay nearby. We said nothing. Fear is a quiet thing at sea. To give it a voice is to give it power. On the third day, an island appeared on the horizon. Small, rocky, unremarkable. The map did not show it, at least. Not at first. But when we looked again, it was there, a faint outline, as if the ink was still drying, still bleeding into the parchment. The crew grew quiet. A hushed tension fell over the deck, thick as the sea fog. The map wasn't predicting our route, it was recording it. I watched it closely after that, like a hawk watching its prey. Whenever we chose a new heading, the lines on the map adjusted. They shifted, slowly settling into place like a memory being written in real time. Areas we deliberately avoided began to fade, growing pale and indistinct, as if the map was forgetting them. That night, the compass spun wildly, once, then stopped. It wasn't pointing north. It was pointing directly at the map itself, trembling as if in reverence or terror. We began to understand the rule of this impossible object. The map wanted us to follow it. It wasn't just a guide, it was our guide. When the wind died completely, leaving us adrift on a glassy sea, the ink on the parchment darkened, almost black. When we hesitated at a fork in the currents, the paper itself creased slightly, urging a fold toward a clearer path, a silent command. Just before dawn on the 4th day, a new mark appeared. An island symbol, but different from the others. It was encircled. Underlined? A declaration. The crew gathered around the chart table, our faces lit by a single lantern, staring. No one recognized the symbol, yet everyone felt the same gravitational pull on unspoken certainty that this was where the map ended. This was our destination. By midday, land rose on the horizon, a silhouette against the sun. It was exactly where the map said it would be. The island was a paradox, lush with strange, oversized flora, but eerily silent. No birdsong, no rustle of unseen animals. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of damp earth, something else, something metallic and sweet. The map had led us to a single cove, a perfect crescent of black sand. As the anchor dropped, the ink on the parchment began to move again. The island on the map, our destination, started to fill in with incredible detail. It drew paths we hadn't yet walked, marked a spring we hadn't yet found, and placed a single, ominous X deep in the island's interior. The map was no longer recording our past. It was now dictating our future. Hesitantly, a shore party was formed. I led them. The map clutched in my hand. It felt warm to the touch now, almost humming. We followed the newly drawn path, which materialized before us as a barely trodden trail through the dense jungle. Every step was a confirmation. Every turn, a validation of the map's power. It was exhilarating and terrifying. We were not explorers. We were puppets. We reached the spring, a pool of water so clear it looked like liquid crystal. We drank, and the water was cool and invigorating. For a moment, we felt a sense of relief, a brief respite from the gnawing dread. But then, as we prepared to press on, the path on the map leading to the X began to glow with a faint, pulsing light. There was no choice. The map was compelling us forward. The X marked the entrance to a cave, hidden behind a curtain of thick vines. Inside, the air was cold. The walls were covered in carvings. Not of any culture we knew. They depicted ships, stars, and maps that looked just like ours. Deeper within, we found a chamber. In the center, on a stone pedestal, lay another map. It looked identical to ours, but it showed a completely different set of islands, a different ocean, and next to it, a logbook. I opened it. The last entry was dated over a century ago. The captain wrote of a map that changed, a map that recorded their journey. He wrote of following it to this very island, Tisberi Kabe. He wrote of finding another map on the pedestal. His final words were chilling. "The map has given us a new world to chart," he wrote. "It will not let us leave until we have filled it. This is not a destination. It is a new beginning, a new prison." As I read those words, the map in my hand changed one last time. Our ship, anchored in the cove, vanished from the parchment. The ocean we had just crossed faded away. In its place, new coastlines and strange continents bloomed into existence, a vast, unknown world waiting to be recorded. We looked at each other, the truth dawning on us like a cold, merciless sunrise. We hadn't discovered the island. The island had captured us. We were the new cartographers for a cursed atlas, bound to a ship that would follow a map that would never stop changing. And out on the horizon of the parchment, a new island symbol had just begun to form, faint as a ghost, waiting for us to find it. The island grew larger as we approached, jagged cliffs rising like teeth from the water. Every single detail matched the map perfectly: the coves, the rocks, the narrow channel that seemed far too small for our ship. No one spoke. Words felt unnecessary. The map's influence had settled over us quietly, like a tide that had already reached every corner of the vessel. I remember stepping onto the deck to check our line of sight. The sea around the island shimmered strangely, its reflections all misaligned, the colors just slightly off. It was as if the water itself were aware we were following a map that had a will of its own. Then I noticed it. I looked down at the table below deck, and the map had changed again. The ink now formed tiny symbols all along the coastline. They weren't names. They weren't numbers. Just small, repeating shapes I couldn't recognize, and they didn't feel like instructions. They felt like warnings. A soft vibration seemed to pass through the table, then up through the floorboards. The ship slowed down on its own, drifting closer and closer to the shore, even though no orders had been given. Crew members exchanged nervous glances, but made no move to correct our course. The map was guiding us, and resisting it felt impossible. A mist rolled off the cliffs and poured into the channel. It was thick, wet, cold. It wrapped itself around the ship, hiding the waves, hiding the rocks, hiding the entire world beyond. The map pulsed slightly in my hands, as if it were alive. The strange symbols shimmered under the dim light of the lantern, and I suddenly realized we weren't just following the map, we were being led. By the time the first anchor hit the sand, the mist had thickened completely. The cliffs were gone, replaced by shadows that shifted unnaturally, forming shapes that should not exist in nature. The map's outline still matched the land perfectly, but the land itself was changing right underneath it. And then, from the mist, voices began to emerge. They weren't speaking words. just soft echoes of the crew talking, repeating fragments of conversations we hadn't even had yet. A chilling realization washed over me. The map wasn't just guiding our path, it was predicting our future. The captain's voice was a low whisper next to me. We follow it, or we remain at sea forever. And wait that, the ship moved forward once more, the map glowing faintly under the lantern light, urging us toward a destination none of us truly understood. As we sailed deeper into the mist, the air grew heavy, thick with the scent of salt water, and something else, something ancient and earthy. The map continued its subtle transformations. The symbols along the coast shifted, rearranging themselves into new patterns. It was a language. I was sure of it, but one no living person had ever spoken. Each pulse of light from the parchment seemed to synchronize with the ship's gentle rocking, as if the vessel itself had become an extension of the map's will. I watched the crew. Their faces were pale in the lantern light, a mixture of fear and fascination etched into their features. They moved with a strange, dreamlike precision, hoisting sails and checking ropes without any verbal commands. It was as if the map was communicating with them directly, planting instructions into their minds. We were no longer a crew operating a ship. We were puppets on a stage, our strings pulled by an unseen master. The voices in the mist grew clearer, more distinct. I heard my own voice among them, saying things I hadn't yet thought, asking questions I hadn't yet formed. The feeling was deeply unsettling, a violation of the most private space my own mind. The future was no longer a distant shore. It was a fog we were sailing directly into, and the map was the only thing illuminating the path. Suddenly, the ship shuddered to a halt. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the drip of condensation from the rigging. Ahead, a faint light pierced through the fog. It wasn't the sun, and it wasn't a lighthouse. It was a soft, ethereal glow, beckoning us forward. The map in my hands grew warmer, the symbols along the coastline now pulsing with a steady, rhythmic beat, like a heart. The captain pointed toward the light. "There," he said, his voice barely audible. "That's where it wants us to go." We lowered a longboat into the water. The sea was unnervingly calm, the surface like black glass, reflecting the strange glow above. Myself, the captain, and 2 other crew members climbed in, the map safely tucked into my coat. As we rowed away from the ship, its silhouette was quickly swallowed by the mist, leaving us alone in a world of gray and shimmering light. The further we rowed, the more the landscape revealed itself. The mist thinned, unveiling a shoreline not of sand or rock, but of smooth polished obsidian. The light emanated from the center of the island, where bizarre twisted trees grew in a spiral, their leaves glowing with a soft, phosphorescent light. The air hummed with a low, resonant frequency that vibrated deep in my bones. We beached the longboat on the black shore and stepped onto the island. The ground felt solid, yet it seemed to absorb all sound. Our footsteps were silent. I pulled out the map. It had changed once more. It no longer showed a coastline, but a detailed layout of the island's interior, a winding path leading directly to the grove of glowing trees. The symbols were gone, replaced by a single, intricate spiral at the very center. As we followed the path, the voices from the mist returned, but this time they were different. They weren't echoes of our future conversations. They were whispers from the past, the voices of other sailors, other crews who had followed this same map. They spoke of wonders and terrors, of finding paradise and of being lost forever. Their warnings and their hopes swirled around us, ghostly companions on our journey. We finally reached the center of the grove. In the middle of the spiraling trees stood a stone pedestal, and on it, an object that made my breath catch in my throat. It was a book, bound in the same strange, shifting material as the map. It was open, and its pages were filled with the same symbols we had seen earlier. The captain approached it slowly, his hand outstretched. As his fingers brushed against the page, the symbols flared with light, and the entire island hummed with a powerful energy. The voices fell silent. The air grew still. I looked down at the map in my hands. It was blank. The ink had vanished completely, leaving behind nothing but an empty piece of parchment. Its purpose was served. It had led us here. Some maps do not guide you. Some maps wait for you to follow. Some maps decide for you We had reached the destination, but I had a sinking feeling that our journey was only just beginning. The book on the pedestal was not an end. It was a new beginning, a new set of rules for a game we didn't understand. And as the captain opened the book wider, the glowing light of the trees intensified, casting our long shadows against the strange, silent world we had discovered. We were no longer following a map. We were now part of it. It was a misty morning when we spotted it. From afar, the ship looked like a skeleton floating on the water. No hull, no visible sides. Just the masts, the rigging, and the faint outline of a deck hovering above the waves. It was impossible. A paradox, sailing on a calm, gray sea. Yet it floated there, steady, neither sinking nor swaying with the gentle tide. My crew hesitated. I could feel their unease, a cold dread that mirrored the morning chill. No one wanted to approach this phantom vessel, but curiosity, or perhaps a sense of inevitability, pulled us closer, our own ship cutting silently through the water as if drawn by an unseen force. As we drew nearer, the impossible details sharpened. The deck was completely intact. Ornate railings curved naturally, following the lines of a structure that simply wasn't there. Steps led down from the quarterdeck to nowhere, descending into thin air above the water. Cabins with doors and windows hovered in space, unsupported by any visible walls. And through those windows, we saw shadows inside. Shadows that moved, flitting past the panes, as if people were walking within but no walls held them. It was a ghost ship in the truest sense, a memory of a vessel sailing on a sea of fog. Our captain, a man not easily spooked, hailed them. "Ahoy there! What ship are you?" His voice, usually a booming command that could cut through a gale, seemed to die in the air. It just vanished, swallowed by the silence before it could even reach the strange vessel. We tried again, a chorus of voices shouting into the mist. But the effect was the same. No sound carried. It was as if a bubble of absolute silence surrounded the ship, deflecting our world from its own. One of the crew, a young, brave soul named Finn, volunteered to go across. We maneuvered our longboat closer, and he cautiously extended a hand toward the gangway that hung suspended in the air. The moment his fingers touched the wood, he flinched, then nodded. "It's solid," he called back, his voice strained. "It's warm." He stepped onto it, testing his weight. The gangway didn't move. It was as firm as the deck of our own ship. He walked up his boots, making soft thuds that we could barely hear, and stepped onto the deck of the Phantom. The instant his foot touched the deck, the entire ship trembled, just a slight shudder, like a living creature taking a slow, deep breath. Then a faint hum began. It wasn't the sound of engines or the whine of wind through rigging. It was a vibration that resonated deep in your bones. A low, almost musical thrum that seemed to emanate from the very non-existent structure of the ship itself. It was the ship's heartbeat. My own curiosity finally won out over my fear. I followed Finn, climbing the unnervingly solid gangway. As I did, I noticed something else. The air just below the floating deck shimmered, like heat rising from asphalt on a summer day. It wasn't just empty space. The area where the hull should have been seemed to bend the very light and air around it, creating invisible ripples that held the deck suspended, isolated from the sea below. It wasn't that the hull was missing. It was that the ship existed in a different kind of space, one that only partially intersected with our own. On board, the illusion of normalcy was even more disturbing. Inside the cabins, furniture appeared solid and real. A table was set with cups and plates. Bunks were neatly made. Everything was present and accounted for. But when we leaned closer, looking at our reflections in a polished cup or a window pin, they were wrong. The images were slightly stretched, distorted. Our movements were delayed, our reflections mimicking us a split second after we moved. It felt like we were looking at an echo of ourselves. Then I saw it. On a desk in what looked like the captain's quarters, a leather-bound journal lay open. The handwriting on the page was scrawled and urgent, but it was disturbingly familiar. With a knot forming in my stomach, I realized why. It was my own handwriting. The entry described the misty morning, the discovery of a ship without a hull, The crew's hesitation. I was reading about events that had happened only moments ago, written by a hand I knew to be mine, on a ship I had never set foot on. Not yet. The ship wasn't just a ghost. It was something more. It was aware. It was recording us, observing our every move, our every thought. Outside, the sea remained perfectly still, a placid mirror under a featureless gray sky. The tall masts swayed gently, but there was no wind to move them. The rigging hummed with that subtle, persistent tension, as if the ship itself was breathing, exhaling a silent song. And then the first whisper came. It wasn't a voice you could hear with your ears. It was a thought planted directly in your mind, a feeling, a gentle pull toward the bow of the ship, an unspoken instruction urging us forward, deeper into this impossible structure that both existed and didn't. We had boarded a ship without a hull. We were trespassers in its strange reality, and it was already clear that this vessel, this entity, had chosen its next course, and we were now part of its crew. The question wasn't where we were going, but when the deck beneath my feet felt solid, yet weightless. Each step produced no sound, but the vibration of the ship pulsed faintly through my body, like a heartbeat too slow to measure. The crew followed cautiously, their eyes wide, fixed on the impossibility surrounding us. The water flowed freely beneath the deck, but did not touch it. Waves lapped at nothing, at an invisible barrier that held the sea at bay. A faint, otherworldly light appeared ahead, shimmering from the bridge. We approached it together, a silent procession of disbelieving sailors. Inside, the instruments were working, but not as they should. Gauges pointed to empty space, their needles trembling with unseen forces. The ship's compass spun lazily, completely ignoring magnetic north. No matter how we turned, it would always realign itself, pointing toward a direction the ship itself desired. Then, one by one, the crew noticed it. The shadows, not their own, but others. Figures moved silently inside the cabins, bending around corners where no corners existed. They appeared and disappeared in doorways that shouldn't be there. Each shadow was a faint, fleeting reflection of someone who had never boarded this vessel, yet somehow perhaps it was an echo of us from another time. Perhaps it was a memory of someone else entirely. Or perhaps it was the ship itself, showing us glimpses of its long, strange existence. I found myself drawn to the helm, the captain's post. The large wooden wheel turned decently under my hands, almost frictionless, even though no ropes or mechanisms connected it to anything below. As I rotated it, the ship responded instantly, gliding forward with perfect, silent ease. It cut through the water beneath nothing, leaving no wake, no trace of its passage. A soft, low hum that we'd heard earlier began to grow, becoming a song, a resonant, ancient melody that seemed to guide us forward. It was then that the true nature of our vessel began to dawn on me. The ship wasn't just alive in some biological sense. It was aware. It possessed a consciousness, a presence older than its material form, older than any crew that had ever touched its phantom wood. The horizon ahead began to shimmer strangely, distorting like a heat haze on a summer road. Shapes appeared in the distance, impossible to define. Islands that bent the eye, their coastlines twisting into unnatural geometries. Waves that folded into themselves, defying the laws of physics. Skies that didn't match the sun above, painted with colors no human eye had ever seen. And then the whispers started. They weren't words, not voices carried on the air. They were thought, planted directly into our minds. Invitations, gentle suggestions, directions that seemed to grow from the very deck beneath our feet. Come this way. Follow. Stay. You edged. Some of the crew stopped in their tracks, their faces slack, entranced by the silent commands. Others tried to speak, to call out to each other, but the sound didn't carry. It was as if the air itself had stolen their voices. Only I, at the helm, could feel the full, undeniable tug of the ship's intent. It wasn't forceful, but it was persistent, a steady pull on my will. We moved forward, deeper and deeper into this impossible sea. This ocean of The hullless vessel glided on, carrying us toward a place that might not exist anywhere outside its own memory. The water below reflected nothing of the ship, yet the masts, sails, and rigging cast long, dark shadows upon it. These shadows bent and twisted unnaturally, writhing like living things on the surface of the non-existent water. It was in that moment, watching the dance of impossible shadows, that I finally understood. We were no longer aboard a ship in the traditional sense. We were aboard a thought, a memory, an idea given form, sailing on a sea of pure consciousness. And it knew we had come. The presence I felt, the awareness that permeated every plank and rope, wasn't just a passive force. It was intelligent, ancient, and it had been waiting. It knew we were here, and it was taking us somewhere. The destination was a mystery, but one thing was certain. We had crossed a threshold from which there was no turning back. We were passengers on a ghost, sailing into the heart of its dream. The air grew thick, with a palpable sense of anticipation. The ship, or the consciousness that was the ship, seemed to hum with a quiet excitement. I could feel it through the wheel in my hands, a subtle vibration that resonated with my own pulse. The whispers in our minds grew more distinct, not forming words, but conveying complex emotions, curiosity, welcome, and a deep, ancient loneliness. It felt as if we were the first visitors it had entertained in centuries, or perhaps millennia. The crew members who had been entranced slowly began to stir, their eyes clearing. But they were changed. A new understanding, a quiet acceptance, settled upon them. They no longer looked at our surroundings with fear, but with a kind of reverent awe. They moved about the deck, touching the ethereal railings, looking at the phantom cabins, not as intruders, but as guests. They had accepted the ship's invitation. I looked out at the ever-shifting horizon. The strange islands were closer now, their impossible shapes solidifying. I could see trees with leaves of pure light, mountains that spiraled into the unnaturally colored sky. This place was not of our world, yet it felt strangely familiar, like a forgotten dream. The ship's song deepened, its melody weaving through the strange landscape, and the landscape seemed to respond. The light from the trees pulsed in time with the music. The spiraling mountains seemed to turn slowly, as if dancing to the ship's tune. We were not just passing through this world. We were interacting with it, conducted by the will of our vessel. A crewmate, a young man named Finn, came to stand beside me at the helm. He didn't speak, but he pointed toward the water. I followed his gaze. Below us, in the clear, non-existent depths, shapes were moving. Not fish, but something else. Luminous, abstract forms swirled and coalesced, mirroring the patterns of the stars in the alien sky above. They were thoughts made visible, memories of the sea-given life. The ship was showing us its soul. The feeling of being an intruder had completely vanished. I felt like a part of the ship, and it a part of me. The wheel under my hands was no longer just a tool to steer. It was a point of connection, a way to communicate. I no longer tried to direct our course. Instead, I simply listened, allowing the ship's ancient wisdom to guide my hands. We were in a partnership, a silent dance between man and vessel, mind and memory. We sailed on, the impossible world unfolding around us. The whispers continued, no longer just directions, but stories. Images flooded my mind. Great cosmic battles fought in seas of starlight, silent journeys through nebulae of creation. The birth and death of suns witnessed from this very deck. This ship had not just sailed the oceans of Earth. It had sailed the currents of time and space. It was a wanderer, a chronicler, a living library of experiences far beyond human comprehension. And it was sharing its story with us. We were no longer just a crew. We had become its confidants. As we approached the nearest of the shimmering islands, a new sensation washed over me. It was a sense of arrival. The ship's song soft, its rhythm slowing to a gentle, welcoming cadence. The whispers in my mind coalesced into a single, clear thought. A feeling of home. Not my home, but its home. The place it had been, journeying toward for an eon. The shore of the island was made, not of sand, but of softly glowing motes of light. As the bow of our phantom ship glided over them, they stirred, rising up to greet us like a welcoming crowd. The air was filled with a scent I couldn't describe, a mix of old books, distant rain, and something akin to starlight. The crew stood at the rail, their faces illuminated by the island's gentle glow. Their expressions peaceful. The fear, the confusion, it was all gone, replaced by a profound sense of belonging. The ship had brought us to its sanctuary, a harbor at the edge of reality. I let go of the wheel. My work was done. The ship had found its own way. It drifted to a gentle stop, its non-existent anchor finding purchase in a sea of memory. We had arrived, and as I looked out at the luminous shore, I realized our journey wasn't over. It was just beginning. We were no longer lost sailors. We were explorers in a land of thought. Anticip, this ancient, conscious vessel, was our guide. The story of the hullless ship had become our own. Thank you for joining me on this leg of the journey. What do you think awaits the crew on this island of thought? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, please hit that like button and subscribe for more tales from the impossible. Your support means the world and helps us continue exploring these strange new horizons together. Until next time, stay curious. Have you ever heard of the lighthouse ship? It's a story whispered among old sailors. A ghost tale told on foggy nights when the sea is too quiet. They say it looks like a lighthouse adrift on the waves, not in its shape, but in its presence. Its mast holds a single, powerful lantern, a steady beacon that cuts through the thickest fog and the darkest nights. But this light, it doesn't guide you to the safety of a harbor. It never points toward land. Our story begins with a crew on a long voyage. One night, a pale, unwavering light appeared off their starboard bow, bobbing gently in the churning sea. The fog was so dense it felt like a wall, but the light persisted, softened, but never extinguished. The crew, relieved, called it a beacon, a sign of hope. But the captain, he felt something different, a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. The light didn't feel like a guide. It felt aware, calculating. It felt like it was waiting for them. As their vessel drew nearer, an eerie calm fell over the water. The waves that had been crashing against their hull now seemed to soften, almost as if apologizing for their noise. The lighthouse ship stayed just ahead, a constant, silent companion, always in view, but always just out of reach. It moved without any logical pattern, yet it was impossible to lose. The captain tried to make contact. He hailed it on the radio, his voice echoing in the silent bridge. Nothing, no response, not even a crackle of static. It was a complete, profound silence. But it wasn't empty. It was a silence filled with a heavy, unspoken intent. The closer they got, the more unsettling the scene became. The light from the ship's lantern didn't reflect on the water. Beneath its hull, there wasn't the dark green of the deep sea, but a void, a patch of absolute, consuming blackness. The ship cast a shadow on the waves, a perfect, dark replica of itself. And then a sound, or rather, the impression of a sound. A faint, rhythmic pulse carried on the mist, like a colossal heartbeat, slow and deliberate, thrumming through the very air they breathed. It was the heartbeat of the ocean, or maybe the heartbeat of the ship itself. Hanging from the side of the mysterious vessel was a ladder. It gleamed, looking solid and strangely inviting against the dark, weathered wood. It beckoned them, an open invitation into the unknown. The crew was divided. A few brave or foolish souls were eager to board, to solve the mystery. Others were paralyzed, their eyes locked on the unblinking lantern, mesmerized by its hypnotic glow. The rest, including the captain, were filled with a primal dread. But a choice had to be made. Someone had to go. The captain, feeling the weight of his command, knew it had to be him. He was the first to step across the gap, his boots landing on the deck of the lighthouse ship. The deck was unnervingly warm to the touch, smooth and utterly silent. There was no creaking of wood, no whistle of wind through rigging. It was as if the ship existed in a pocket of absolute stillness, separate from the world. The only thing that moved were the shadows cast by the great lantern above, but they didn't follow the laws of light. They stretched and danced on their own, writhing like living things on a surface that didn't seem to belong to their reality. He ventured inside. The interior was a maze of hallways and cabins, all bathed in the same ghostly light from the single source on the mast. Everything was pristine, yet utterly devoid of life. No dust, no decay, no sign that anyone had ever lived there. In what looked like the captain's quarters, a large, leather-bound logbook lay open on a desk. The captain's hands trembled as he leaned in to read it. The ink was fresh. The entries were written in a neat, elegant script. Each page detailed a ship that had encountered this beacon. It listed their names, their flags, the dates of their encounters, even their exact coordinates. The captain recognized some of the name's vessels, reported lost at sea, vanished without a trace over the years. According to this logbook, they hadn't sunk. They had been found. With a horrifying, soul-crushing clarity, the captain understood. This ship wasn't a guide. It was a collector. It didn't lead ships to safety. It gathered them, erasing them from the world. Their stories ending in the pages of this cursed book. The final entry on the open page was dated today. It described a small freighter, its crew, and its captain. It was his ship. Their ship. He looked up, back towards the companionway, thinking of his crew still waiting, watching the light. The beautiful, steady, welcoming light. The beacon that promised salvation but delivered only oblivion. He now knew the terrible truth. That light was the one signal they were never, ever meant to follow. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic counterpoint to the slow, steady heartbeat of the collector ship. He was trapped. They were all trapped. And as the fog swirled around his own vessel, he watched as it slowly began to fade from view. Not into the mist, but into nothingness. The lighthouse ship had made its catch, and the logbook had a new, finished entry. What do you think happened to the captain? Did he become part of the ship, a ghost bound to its phantom crew? Or is he still there, waiting in an empty cabin for the next ship to follow the light? Let me know your theories in the comments below. These are the kinds of stories that remind us the sea holds secrets we couldn't even begin to imagine. The lantern above pulsed gently, almost like a heartbeat. It was steady, but not comforting. A slow, rhythmic throb that seemed to echo the dread building in my chest. On the deck, the shadows began to stretch and twist, pulling away from the objects that cast them. They took on shapes of their own, suggesting movement where there was none. Each time the lantern flickered, it wasn't random. It felt deliberate, like a pointing finger, guiding our eyes toward parts of the ship that I knew for a fact were UNT on any blueprint we had. I started down the corridor. Each step, a conscious effort. The floor felt strangely warm under the soles of my boots, yet it was utterly silent. No creaks, no groans, nothing. As I moved, doors along the hallway swung open without a sound. I peeked inside. Bedrooms, small cabins, even a tiny galleole of them were pristine, untouched. It was as if no one had ever lived here, as if the ship was a museum exhibit, perfectly preserved and waiting 10, Primera Saw Italiano. The ship's logbook, sitting on a small desk, was glowing with a soft, ethereal light. It was calling to me, pulling me closer. I approached it cautiously. The entries I'd seen before were still there, but now, new lines had appeared, written in the same spidery script, nestled between the old ones. They are following. Do not stray. The light does not guide. It waits. My blood ran cold. These messages weren't there minutes ago. I felt a presence behind me and spun around. One of my crewmates, Jensen, was standing there. His eyes were wide, but they were blank, like looking into two empty windows. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He just watched me, his expression vacant, as if he was waiting for the lantern itself to give him an order. That's when I felt it, truly felt it for the first time, the ship's presence. It wasn't alive in the way a living creature is. It was aware, calculating. It felt like it was inside my head, sifting through my thoughts. It knew who we were, what we were doing here, even tear deep-seated fears we tried to hide. Every step we took, it seemed to anticipate every glance. It recorded. The bridge beckoned, its instruments and controls all lit up, even though no one was touching them. The ship's wheel was turning slowly, methodically, on its own, guiding us forward. but not toward land, not toward safety. We were heading deeper into the suffocating fog. I looked out the bridge windows. The horizon had vanished completely. There was no sky, no sea, just a seamless, churning gray void that stretched into infinity. We were sailing into nothing, and then the whisper came again. Not from the radio this time, but from inside my own mind. A voice that was not my own, clear as day. Follow the light, or stay forever. A shiver traced its way down my spine. A cold, sharp feeling of absolute finality. I forced myself to look away from the mesmerizing void and back at my crew. The sight was terrifying. Some were frozen in place, their faces masks of pure terror. Others were whispering to themselves, their lips moving frantically as if they were trying to argue with a voice in their heads, trying to resist its pull. But some were already lost. They walked forward with a strange, hypnotic gait drawn toward. The lantern's relentless glow like moths to a flame, and in that horrifying moment, the truth slammed into me. This ship wasn't a beacon. It didn't exist to guide anyone to safety. It existed to collect, to gather souls. Those who boarded it became part of its crew, but not in life. They became part of its very essence. First as shadows flitting at the edge of your vision, then as fragmented memories, and then something else entirely. Something unimaginable. I stepped back out onto the deck. The cold, damp air doing nothing to clear my head. The ship moved forward into the void, a ghost vessel on a non-existent sea. The lantern's light cut a brilliant, unwavering path into the fog, stretching out into an infinite, beckoning horizon. It was patient. I looked over the side. The ocean, or what should have been the ocean, no longer reflected anything. Not the sky, not the stars, not even the ship itself. There was only the glow, only the sip, only the silent, terrible promise hanging in the air. I finally understood. Some ships appear as beacons, offering hope in the darkness. Some ships seem to lead you somewhere, but they only lead you nowhere. And some ships just wait. They wait for you to find them. They wait for you to board. They wait for you to follow, willingly. And we had followed the light, and now we would never leave. Thanks for watching. The deck stretched farther than it should have. From the moment we first stepped aboard, the horizon seemed closer, yet the ship itself extended endlessly in both directions. We turned corners and walked straight paths, but no matter how far we traveled, the bow and stern remained completely unseen. The crew grew uneasy. Our footsteps echoed without ever returning. Voices carried faintly for a moment, then just disappeared into the dense air. Every door we passed led to another corridor, each one identical to the last. It felt like we were walking in circles, but the layout was a straight line. I tried to check the instruments. The compass spun lazily, never settling on a direction. Our maps were useless. Even the stars in the night sky didn't align with any of our navigation charts. It was as if we had sailed into a part of the ocean that didn't exist. A low, persistent hum filled the air, vibrating up through the wooden planks of the deck. It wasn't the familiar thrum of the engines. It wasn't the wind whistling through the rigging. It was something else. Something deeper, coming from beneath the planks. The vibration seemed almost conscious, as if it were reacting to our movements, growing stronger when we gathered together and fading when we stood still. At first, we joked about being lost, a simple navigational error, we told ourselves. But then, the lights along the railing began to dim and brighten in strange, rhythmic patterns. It wasn't random. It was a signal. But what was it signaling? Was it counting something? Was it trying to guide us? Or was it a warning? A warning about what lay ahead on this impossible, unending path. I decided to step forward alone, determined to see the bow with my own eyes too, find the end of this madness. But there was no end. There was only more deck, more railings stretching into the misty distance, more shadows clinging to the corners of my vision. Cabins lined the sides of the ship, their doors all slightly ajar. I could see shadows moving inside them, just beyond the edge of recognition. Indistinct shapes that flitted away the moment I tried to focus. The furniture inside remained neat, perfectly arranged, but sometimes it would shift ever so slightly when no one was looking. A chair would be angled differently. A book on a table would be closed when it had been opened. Small, unsettling changes that made you question your own sanity. The air grew thick and damp, heavy with the smell of salt and a pervasive, cloying uncertainty. I could feel the crew's silent panic spreading like a contagion. The sheer endlessness of the ship seemed to warp our perception, stretching not just space, but time itself. An hour could feel like a minute or a day. We lost all track. And then I noticed a faint, new sound. The sound of water. Not the crashing of the sea against the hull, but a gentle dripping, running, echoing from below. It was coming from the deck itself, as if the entire ship were hollow and infinite, and somehow alive. We were trapped on a vessel with no beginning and no end, and it was only just beginning to reveal its secrets. The deck stretched on, longer than any eyes could possibly measure. We walked for what felt like hours, or maybe it was only minutes. Time had lost its meaning here, slipping away like sand through our fingers. The lights that lined the railing pulsed with a faint, almost imperceptible rhythm, casting shadows that writhed and danced on their own. They seemed to hint at movement where there should have been stillness, a life force independent of our own. Every cabin door we passed felt like a small window into a slightly skewed reality. Inside, we'd see familiar Idnaza well-made bed, a cup left on a table, a chair pulled back as if someone had just stood up. But each time we glanced away and looked back, the scene had changed. The cup would be on the other side of the table. The chair would be tucked in. It was as if the ship itself was breathing, subtly rearranging its own reality while we weren't looking. Then came the voices. They echoed faintly down the long, empty corridors, but they weren't ours. They weren't from any crew we recognized. They were whispers of conversations that hadn't happened yet, fragments of arguments that would never find a conclusion, bursts of laughter that were distorted and slowed down, stretching into something unsettling. The compass in my pocket was useless, its needle spinning wildly, endlessly searching for a north that didn't exist here. The maps we had were just paper filled with lies. Even the stars, visible through the wide openings along the deck, were wrong. One moment, they were a familiar constellation. The next, they were inverted or gone entirely, replaced by a deep, starless void. It was then that I noticed one of my crewmates, a man named Jensen, standing frozen by the railing. He was just staring down at the dark water below. As I walked closer, a chill ran down my spine. His reflection in the water wasn't right. It was longer, darker, stretched into an unsettling caricature, and he was smiling, a faint, knowing smirk. Even though Jensen's face was a mask of stoic concentration. I called his name once, then twice. He didn't turn or speak. He just gave a slow, deliberate nod, as if acknowledging something I couldn't see, something just beyond my perception. The low hum we'd felt beneath our feet as we started walking began to grow louder. It wasn't just a mechanical drone anymore. It had a rhythm. It pulsed like a giant, slow heartbeat. Thump thump. Thump thump. Then, as we picked up our pace, so did the beat. It was matching our steps, a monstrous metronome guiding our journey into the unknown. The ship wasn't just a vessel, it was aware. Not alive in the way we understood it, but conscious. It was watching us, recording our every move, guiding us somewhere. We finally reached a bend in the deck that looked familiar. A sense of relief washed over me for a split second. A hope that we were finally circling back. But as we rounded the corner, the relief curdled into dread. The section of deck ahead was an exact mirror of the one we had just walked, but subtly, terrifyingly wrong. It was a distorted echo, a reflection in a warped mirror. With every repetition of the deck, new anomalies began to appear. A section of the railing would be missing, leaving a terrifying gap over the dark water. A cabin door would appear where there was once a solid wall. Another cabin would have an extra door, leading who knows where. I found a hatch on the floor, its metal surface cold to the touch. With a heave, I pulled it open, only to find solid steel beneath it. A hatch that led to nowhere. That's when the horrifying truth finally dawned on me. We weren't traveling across a physical deck anymore. We were moving through something infinite. Something that was folding space and time around itself, governed by rules we couldn't possibly perceive. We were walking through the ship's memory, its consciousness, and then the whisper came. It wasn't a sound that traveled through the air and into my ears. It bloomed directly inside my mind. A cold, clear thought that was not my own. Some will stay. Some will follow forever. Choose your path! The crew hesitated. A collective, silent gasp. Some, gripped by terror, turned to run back the way we came, only to find the corridor behind them, stretching into an impossible distance, even further than the path ahead. Others, mesmerized by the pulsing hum from below, pressed forward, their eyes vacant, as if pulled by an invisible string. I finally understood what the ship demanded. It was a choice, but not a fair one. We could surrender to its endlessness, become part of its eternal journey, or we could remain trapped here forever, trying to escape an escape-proof prison, forever walking a path that leads only to itself. As we stood there, paralyzed by the choice, I looked down at the water again. It rippled faintly, but it wasn't reflecting the deck above anymore. It was reflecting us. Visions of USA's standing area walking forward, turning back, repeating our actions over and over and over again, in a cycle without end. The ship had no destination, eat at no end. And perhaps neither would we. The fog rolled in slowly. At first, it was just this thin, harmless veil crawling along the horizon. You wouldn't have thought anything of it. But by mid-morning, it had completely swallowed the sun. And by noon, the sea itself had vanished. Our world shrank to a few meters of gray, damp air. The sound of the waves, usually a constant companion, was muffled into an eerie silence. It was like the ocean was holding its breath. The air grew thick, heavy, clinging to your skin. Every sound just died before it could travel more than a few feet from your mouth. We tried to raise nearby ships on the radio. Nothing. Just static. We shouted out into the thick, white void. Our voices were swallowed whole. Then we noticed the compass. At first, it just spun gently, like it was uncertain. Then it picked up speed, a frantic, useless dance, before stopping altogether, pointing nowhere familiar. Our electronic instruments started flickering, the screens blinking on and off, as if the fog itself was some kind of electromagnetic interference, confusing their circuits. A strange quiet fell over the crew. It wasn't exactly fear. Not yet. It was more of an instinctive awareness, a primal understanding that our usual rules didn't apply here. Words felt useless, like trying to shout in a vacuum. We were adrift in a world made of nothing but gray. And then we saw it. Or maybe we didn't. It was more like the fog decided to show us something. Silhouette, a massive, old-fashioned ship, just drifting slowly towards us. There was no flag, no navigation lights, not even a single lamp burning. Our radar was blank. As far as our technology was concerned, there was nothing there. But our eyes told a different story. It was undeniably real. A dark shape cutting through the gray like a shadow that had decided to take on solid form. We altered our course, approaching with extreme caution. As we drew nearer, the strangeness of it all intensified. The ship left no wake. For a vessel of that size, moving through the water, there should have been a trail, a disturbance. But there was nothing. It glided over the surface as if it wasn't touching it at all. And the silence, it was absolute. No creak of aging wood, no groan of ropes, not even the whisper of wind against a mast. It was a phantom. The closer we got, the more the fog seemed to thicken around it, clinging to its hull like a shroud. It was as if the mist was actively trying to hide it from us, allowing us only glimpses. One moment, we'd see a section of the railing. The next, it would be swallowed by the gray. By the time we were right alongside it, the ghost ship was almost indistinguishable from the fog, its edges blurring into the endless white. The deck was completely empty. There was no crew in sight. No lifeboats in their davits. No signs of life, recent or otherwise. It was a perfectly preserved vessel, yet utterly deserted. The only indication that it wasn't just a derelict hulk was a faint, soft glimmer coming from the bridge. We could just make out the weak lights of instruments inside, humming with a low, steady energy. They were alive. The fog seemed to have a consciousness of its own, a presence that clung to that strange ship, keeping it separate from our reality. It was like a bubble of another time, another place, floating in our world. On our own boat, we started calling out to each other, just to maintain our bearings, to make sure we were all still there. But the sound vanished almost as soon as it left our lips. Even the sound of our own footsteps on our own deck became muffled, distant, driven by a mix of curiosity and a deep, unsettling need to understand. I decided to board. As my foot touched the deck of the ghost ship, a bizarre sensation ran through me. It felt solid, yet completely weightless, like I was walking on solidified water. Each step I took produced no echo, no sound of impact. It was like the ship itself was absorbing the noise, preserving its perfect silence. The vessel seemed to drift beneath me, floating in some strange space between the sea and the fog itself. I started to explore, my senses on high alert. The silence was so profound it was almost a physical pressure. And that's when I noticed them, the subtle signs, the small, impossible movements. A chair on the bridge, seen through a grim-covered porthole, shifted slightly, as if someone had just stood up. A heavy iron hatch on the deck, when I was certain had been opened moments before, was now quietly, firmly, in the eerie stillness, with absolutely no breeze. A tarnished brass lantern hanging from a beam began to swing gently, back and forth, back and forth. It hit my tin. The ship was alive, not with people, not with a living crew, but with memory. It was haunted by its own past. The echoes of a crew long gone, the phantom energy of countless voyages. The ship was trapped, replaying moments over and over, caught in an endless loop within the fog. Every creak and shift was a ghost of a past action, a memory made manifest. We were intruders in this private, repeating history. And I realized the fog wasn't just a weather phenomenon, it was the medium. It was the prison that held this ship and its memories. It was the tape on which this ghost story was endlessly recorded and replayed. And somewhere in the distance, I could feel it. Beyond the impenetrable wall of gray, the real sea waited, patient, silent. It was always there. It felt like it was watching us, waiting to see what we would do. The fog closed completely around us. It was no longer a curtain, it was a wall. The familiar outlines of our own ship, the rhythmic rise and fall of the waves, even the line of the horizon had vanished. All that remained was the silhouette of that drifting vessel, shimmering faintly, as if it existed in a space entirely apart from our reality. I stepped carefully along the deck, my boots making no sound. Every motion felt strangely amplified inside the thick gray, yet produced no echo, no noise at all. The ship moved slightly under my feet, a gentle, almost imperceptible sway, even though our engines were completely shut down. The air was damp, cold, and incredibly heavy, like trying to breathe inside a waterlogged sponge. And then I noticed them. Footprints, appearing on the wet deck right behind me. They weren't mine. They weren't from anyone on my crew. These prints were clean, precise, and led from nowhere visible. They seemed to begin right at the ship's rail and stretched toward the densest part of the fog, fading gradually, as if the mist itself were slowly consuming them, erasing them from existence. My heart began to pound a heavy, silent rhythm against my ribs. Who could have made them? Where did they go? The bridge beckoned, a faint, protected space in this world of gray. I approached it cautiously, my hand resting on the cold steel of the railing. Inside, the instruments were alive, but not in a way that made any sense. They flickered with unfamiliar readings, numbers and symbols I'd never seen before. The navigation screens displayed coordinates that shifted constantly, locations that did not exist on any map I had ever studied. It was as if we were sailing through a phantom geography, a world drawn from a nightmare. Then, a voice whispered. It was soft, distorted, and chillingly close. It didn't come through the radio or any comm system. It was just there, in the air, all around me. You shouldn't have come. I spun around, my eyes scanning the empty bridge. Nothing. Only the thick, suffocating fog pressing against the windows, distorting the world outside into a formless blur. A cold dread, colder than the sea air, seeped into my bones. I grabbed the radio handset, my hand trembling slightly. I tried to call the crew, my voice cracking with an urgency I couldn't control. David, Maria, anyone? Report in. Static. Complete silence. I rushed back out onto the deck, calling their names into the oppressive quiet. David, where are you? No answer. Their usual positions were empty. The winch they were working on was abandoned mid-task. Not a sound, not a movement. There was only the faintest impression of presence, like a memory of people rather than the people themselves. It was as if they had simply evaporated into the mist, leaving behind nothing but a chilling emptiness. Suddenly, the ship lurched, a gentle, deliberate nudge, as if pushed by an immense, unseen hand. The movement was smooth, not like being struck by a wave. My gaze snapped forward. The fog shifted, parting just enough to reveal a faint, ethereal glow far ahead. I squinted, trying to make out its source. Was it the open sea, a distant lighthouse, or was it another ghost ship? Its lights glowing weakly, indistinguishable in the endless gray. The line between what was real and what was merely a reflection had completely vanished. I felt trapped in a hall of mirrors, where every choice I made seemed mirrored, preempted, or erased before I could even complete it. Thinking of turning the engines on felt pointless. The ship was already moving. Shouting for my crew felt like yelling into a void that had already swallowed them. Then, a new sound. A faint bell tolled somewhere out on the deck. It wasn't our ship's bell. It didn't come from any instrument on the bridge. Not from any mast. It was a clear, lonely sound, and each soft toll echoed in the fog. Counting a time I could not measure. 1, 2, 3. The counts were slow, deliberate, marking the passage of something other than minutes or hours. It was in that moment, with the sound of the phantom bell ringing in my ears, that I finally understood. The fog was not a natural weather phenomenon. It was intentional. The ship, my ship, was caught inside it, not trapped by a random accident of the sea, but by a deliberate, calculated design. This place, this state of being, was a trap. And to leave, I realized with a sickening certainty, I would have to follow its rules. To navigate this impossible sea, I would have to stop questioning, stop fighting. To survive, I would have to move, as it allowed me to move. The rational sailor in me screamed that this was madness. But every instinct I had told me it was the only way. As if responding to my thoughts, a path appeared, faintly, just barely visible in the mist. A channel of slightly clearer air opened up before the bow. The ship began to drift forward into it, slowly, gracefully. Every motion seemed guided. Every choice I thought I was making felt carefully mirrored, or perhaps even dictated, by the fog around me. And somewhere ahead, the horizon waited, or perhaps it never would. I was no longer sure of anything. Some ships disappear into fog and are lost forever. Some ships simply vanish from maps, their stories ending in a question mark. But some ships continue on, caught in the twilight space between what is seen and what is only remembered, sailing an endless ocean of mist. And I think we had just become one of them. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this journey into the unknown, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more stories from the deep. Let me know in the comments what you think happened to the crew. And as our story fades into the night, I hope the shadows felt gentle and the silence kind. If your eyes are feeling heavy, let them close. Let the echoes of this tale drift quietly away with your thoughts. If you've found comfort here tonight, you're always welcome to return. New stories will be waiting for you just beyond the dark. Feel free to like the video or subscribe if this space brings you peace, but only when it feels right for you. Until next time, rest well, sleep deeply. And remember, even in the quiet darkness, you are never alone.